Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is under pressure to set out a post-war plan for Gaza. His political rival, Benny Gantz, has given Netanyahu a June 8th deadline to produce one, or he's threatening to quit the government. For years, a two-state solution for Palestinians has been at the center of Middle East peace efforts, but it's been a difficult roadmap to follow.
This is Gaza in ruins after 8 months of war. But there are plans to rebuild it, the so-called day after when the war ends. Israel's biggest ally, the US, wants Israelis, Palestinians and regional governments to take steps towards establishing an independent Palestinian state side by side with Israel. The two-state solution is as old as the State of Israel itself. In 1947, the United Nations drew up a plan for Israeli and Palestinian nations. The territory marked here in red would be Palestinian, that in grey would be Israeli. But those plans were rejected by Arab states. British occupying forces pulled out in 1948 and Israel was founded, triggering a war with its Arab neighbours. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled from their homes. The war and its aftermath pushed the founding of any Palestinian state into the future. In 1967, another war with its neighbours left a victorious Israel in control of all the land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, the beginning of its occupation of Palestinian lands. Starting in the 1990s, there was a diplomatic push for a long-term peace deal, where Israel would allow a Palestinian state in exchange for security guarantees. The proposed state was already much smaller than in 1947. It would include the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. But there are many obstacles to establishing even this diminished Palestinian state. Right now, Israel's wartime government, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, is in charge of a nation still in shock after Hamas's terror attacks of October 7th. Netanyahu has repeatedly said that an independent Palestine would result in more terror attacks and has vowed to block it. Then there's the issue of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. These communities and outposts are illegal under international and Israeli law, but receive government protection. They take up much of the land that would be part of a Palestinian state. Other disagreements are also not easy to solve. Both sides dispute who should control water supplies. Many Palestinians want a right to return to their homes that they lost in 1948 in Israel itself. And both sides claim Jerusalem as their capital, but the city is cut off from the rest of the West Bank by a wall. Of all these obstacles, the biggest may be the mood in Israel. Netanyahu may be unpopular, but public opinion polls show overwhelming opposition to a Palestinian state. In the meantime, one idea is an international coalition that would administer Gaza temporarily, en route to it becoming part of a Palestinian state along with the West Bank.
Well, my next guest joined Fatah, the party which controls the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. At the age of just 14, he spent 5 years in an Israeli prison for violence during the First Intifada. Today, he says he sees a way to end the conflict in the Middle East. I'm happy to welcome to the program Palestinian activist Samra Sinijlawi. Mr. Sinijlawi, it's good to have you with us. An end to this fighting and peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. How do you propose both sides get to that place?
Well, thanks a lot for inviting me. I think, we are passing very hard days today. The public mood is very much confused. There is a cocktail of feelings, anger, sadness, grief. So the public mood is in a very bad position today. So, but yet, when this war will end, the Palestinians and Israelis will realize that there are in this piece of land 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews, and they are living in the same land, and they need to find a way to coexist. And I think there is only one way to achieve this goal, because apparently the most important issue for the Israelis is to be able to live in a Jewish democratic state. And to achieve this, they need to separate from the million of Palestinians. So the only option that is practical, and this is still applicable, is the two-state solution. If we take this two-state solution outside, what is left on the table? What will be left on the table is an apartheid, which nobody is willing to be there. So I think it's in the best interest of the Israelis and in the best interest of the Palestinians is to achieve the two-state solution. And this is a solution that is endorsed by the international community.
Let me ask you, Mr. Sinijlawi, let me just ask you, though, you know what the polls, what public opinion is in Israel right now. So why do you think Israelis would ever be on board and support the plan that you're supporting, this two-state solution? What do you think is going to change in the mindset of Israelis?
I know Israelis very well. I have been in dialogue with the Israelis for the last 30 years. And I talk to Israelis from the left, from the center, and from the right. And sometimes I tell them, I know you better than you know yourselves, because they don't talk to each other. I talk to all of them. Let's take the example of 1973, the war, when Egypt launched the war against Israel. The whole public opinion in Israel was anti-Egyptian. They hated the Egyptians. There was a lot of anger against Egypt. And then when Sadat decided to come and have his famous visit to the Knesset and address the Israelis in a straightforward speech that was calling for coexistence, that was calling for reconciliation, that he offered peace, the Israelis all signed in. He changed the public opinion in one night. This could be happen now also, in our case now, between the Israelis and Palestinians. What we are lacking here is leadership. Unfortunately, we have lack of leadership on both sides.
I want to ask you about that.
If we have leaders.
Let me ask you about that in just a second, Mr. Sinijlawi, about leadership. But let's talk about the current war right now. Would it be in Israel's interest to end this war? You know there are calls for a ceasefire. Would it be in Israel's interest to end this war if Hamas has not been destroyed?
Well, we need to put realistic targets for this war. 8 months now, and it has been clear that there is no military solution for Hamas. Hamas cannot be defeated completely through this war. Nobody expected that this war will go for 8 months. And it was clear that the Israelis have used their maximum power in this war. And there was a full support from the international community, from the Americans. The ammunition, the arms were supported to Israel. I mean, Israel had everything that it needs military to defeat Hamas, but they couldn't they couldn't reach there.
So you don't think it's possible?
What should be done now?
Do you think it's possible though? I mean, do you agree with the Israeli government that Hamas must be destroyed?
If we want to let this war for another 10 years, with this number of huge civilian casualties on the Palestinian side, yes, maybe. But I think nobody wants to allow this price. I mean, Israel has given a chance to achieve military whatever they can do. But I'll tell you how Hamas can be defeated. Hamas can be defeated if we stop the war now, release the Israeli hostages, and start a process of reconstruction, and start a process of maybe isolating Gaza from Israel, but opening Gaza to the world, having a relief, having hope for Palestinians. 2.3 million Palestinians are now very much sensitive from the destruction that Hamas brought upon them. They would like to see a way of construction, of hope, and they will sign in. This is the way that we can.
Let me pick up. I want to pick up on that. You're calling for Hamas to release the Israeli hostages. You've condemned the attack on Israel October 7th. Why hasn't Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, or any other Palestinian leader for that matter, why haven't they condemned the atrocities of October 7th?
Because I think he hasn't the vision of a leader. He hasn't the capability to understand what was the moment at that time, what was his obligation at that time. And he did not only maybe disappoint the international community on this. He keeps disappointing the Palestinian people on a lot of issues. This man was elected for a term of 4 years in 2005 that ended in 2009, and he continued to self-employ himself until today. This man controls completely everything, the executive branch, the legislative branch. He controls the judiciary system, the media, the diplomacy, the money. He controls everything. And he is 90 years old. And you can imagine each task of these needs a team of 30, 40 young Palestinians to be able to perform well. So he's holding everything in his hands, and his performance is very negative. So he is not capable to do any good job, not only to assess what he should be, doing on the 7th of October or later.
Let's talk about, if someone were to replace him, considering what has happened in the last 8 months, it's feasible to think that the Palestinians maybe would choose someone who's even harder on Israel, much more radical. I mean, do you not worry that replacing him would only make the conflict worse? I mean, many of the allies of the Palestinians, as well as the Israelis, consider Abbas to be a safe pair of hands.
Well, this is completely disconnected from the reality. The Palestinian people are upset. They are not happy from the corruption that Abbas brought upon them in the West Bank and from the destruction that Hamas brought upon them in Gaza. Most of the Palestinians, the majority of Palestinians, would like to see an alternative that brings hope and construction, an alternative that will be able to work with the Israelis onto some kind of dynamics that will benefit both the Israelis and Palestinians. We need to bring up a strategy from the Palestinian side that puts the Israeli security at its basis from our own interest. Mm-hmm. And then maybe we will persuade the Israelis to bring up a strategy that will put the human dignity and well-being and national aspiration of the Palestinians at its basis. These two strategies can help the Palestinians and Israelis reconcile.
Mr. Sinijlawi,
step by step.
Let me ask you before we've got just about a minute left. Is there someone who is an obvious replacement for Mahmoud Abbas? Is there someone that you would recommend?
Well, there is a generation of leadership. The younger generations that Abbas have been blocking them to participate in leading the Palestinian people, including, for example, Mohammed Dahlan, who lives in exile now. Mm-hmm. Abbas deported him. And Dr. Nasser Qudwe, he is the strongest candidate to have a unification government that can have the respect of the street and the international community and also the trust of the Israelis. We need to have a candidate like these people who are able to have the trust of the Palestinian people and work in cooperation with the Israelis and the international community.
Mr. Sinijlawi, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us, and I appreciate you being very forthright and open with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's get more from Israeli peace activist Gershon Baskin. He's also an author and negotiated with Hamas for the release of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit back in 2011. Welcome, Mr. Baskin. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in January flatly rejected the idea of a Palestinian state. That means the two-state solution is dead, isn't it?
No, the most surprising outcome of this war that we're seeing, this horrible war in Gaza, is that the two-state solution is back on the table, more than perhaps it's ever been before. We've been talking about a two-state solution for more than 30 years. It is true that in the last years it seemed that it was no longer viable, but it's back on the table. And increasing numbers of countries around the world which have yet to recognize the state of Palestine or the state of Israel are doing that. And this is going to push both Israel and Palestine to the table in a regional framework. We have something else that developed during this war, is we saw the creation of a regional defense alliance that defended Israel on the night that Iran attacked it. These are all opening up possibilities for a renewed discussion of the two-state solution and turning it into something that is viable.
You say that the two-state solution is back on the table, but is it back on the table of Benjamin Netanyahu? Because he is clearly opposed to it, and also it appears that the majority of Israelis are also opposed to the plan. Therefore, I ask again, based on this, it would appear that the two-state solution in Israel is dead.
Right. Well, I think we should be realistic and look at the fact that public opinion during wartime is slanted. It's not accurate. It doesn't really assess what the public may think the day after the war. Right now, people are traumatized, both in Israel and in Palestine. And with regard to Mr. Netanyahu is history. It's just a matter before he's thrown out of office in new elections or in some other way that will happen here, because Netanyahu is blamed by the majority of Israelis for what led to October 7th and for the mismanagement of the war since October 7th. He has lost most of his base, and I think that very few people think that he actually has a chance of coming back to power after we have new elections in Israel, and the people of Israel are demanding new elections.
Minister in his government, Benny Gantz, has threatened to walk out of the government by Saturday if his six-point plan for the day after in Gaza isn't approved. You are saying that the Netanyahu government will fall if he does so?
No, Netanyahu still has a clear majority in the government, even if Gantz leaves the government. But I think once Gantz leaves the government, if he does, there will be even more massive demonstrations taking place in Israel by the Israeli public calling for an end to this government. There are voices within the hardline coalition of Netanyahu who believe that they will fare better after elections, and they may bolt the government. There's going to be increased international pressure, particularly from the United States, on the Netanyahu government to accept the plan that the Netanyahu government put out on the table for the return of the Israeli hostages and a ceasefire and an end to the war as the United States wants, and the whole world wants an end to this war. So yes, I think that the increasing pressure is going to eventually lead to the fall of this government, and this is what we in Israel, who believe in peace, need to work for.
Let's talk about peace, and in particular the two-state solution, because Benny Gantz has also talked about a governing alternative for Gaza. And you have also suggested in a blog that you wrote for the Times of Israel that it should be the Palestinian Authority. Will Hamas accept this?
Right. I didn't say the Palestinian Authority. I actually said members of the opposition to the current Palestinian Authority, mainly from the Fatah party. It has to be authorized by President Abbas. But President Abbas and his authority cannot govern Gaza. They can't send anyone to Gaza. It needs to be Palestinians who come from Gaza, who live in Gaza, as well as other Palestinians who are respected and have legitimacy amongst the Palestinians. No non-Palestinian body can govern Gaza without being looked at by the Palestinian people as another form of occupation. So it really has to come from within Palestine. They need to determine what kind of peacekeeping force can be brought to Gaza, probably an Arab-led peacekeeping force that will enable and force Israel to withdraw from Gaza. Israel cannot remain in Gaza. This should be clear to everyone after Israel had 18 years experience of fighting insurgency in Lebanon. There is no sustainable solution for Israel to remain in Gaza.
Does this plan assume that there will be no Hamas in Gaza, and therefore there will be somebody in Gaza who can represent the Palestinian people in Gaza?
No, Hamas is not disappearing. Let's be realistic about this. Hamas is part of Palestinian society. It is the Palestinian people's challenge how to disarm Hamas, how to make Hamas into a legitimate member of the government or the polity. I do not envision any kind of acceptable government, acceptable by the international community, acceptable by the Arab states, by Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and others, that would be governed by Hamas. Hamas is the voice of yesterday. Hamas is a Palestinian problem, and the Palestinian people need to determine how to integrate a legitimate Islamic political party into their governance, but it cannot be an armed militia within a state which is being called a sovereign state and being recognized as such. As a state, they have a responsibility and an obligation to international law and to being a just and legitimate member of the community of nations, which means that they cannot have an armed militia within their borders.
We'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks so much for joining us today. Israeli peace activist Gershon Baskin. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.